Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast. And as usual, I'm joined by Tracey Bestis to take us through another half hour of SMSF issues. How are you, Tracey? It's great to see you as usual.
Thank you so much, Darin. I'm so excited to be here and I'm doing really well. Thank you very much.
That's great to hear. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by Super Fund Property Valuations. Take the tension out of tax time by making Super Fund Property Valuations your number one choice for all your SMSF property valuation requirements. Order a report today by filling in your details on the online form at superfundpropertyvaluations.com.au and let Superfund Property Valuations take care of the hard work. And I always put on the end of that how important valuations are for your SMSF in so many ways, not just from a compliance perspective, but also from a strategy perspective as well, because it obviously allows you to have a more accurate picture of where you're at. And of course, that determines where you can go and where you would like to go with your SMSF. But we're not here to talk about valuations specifically today. We're actually moving on to tax issues with your SMSF. We thought it'd be a good time to sort of discuss this because we're obviously leading up to the 30th of June. And my criticism of whenever these things are raised is that they're never raised early enough. So people usually talk about them maybe at the end of May, if you're lucky. Very often the discussion doesn't happen until midway through June. And of course, we know that if you're actually going to put effective strategies in place, June's a little bit too late. It's got to be, it's not completely too late, but for a comprehensive outcome, it's probably a little bit too late. So we're going to get ahead of the ball, get ahead of the curve a little bit today and start talking about that. But Trace, you're going to actually kick it off. There were some stats recently that were issued by the ATO for the SMSF sector, which showed some interesting insights into the way some of the SMSF activity is trending at the moment. So you just noticed a couple of things that piqued your interest, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly, Darin. And I'm such a stats girl, and I love looking at the ATO statistics. Very sad, I know, but anyway, that's just me. And the December quarter stats came out from the ATO a few weeks ago now, but we just hadn't had a chance to talk about it until now. And I just wanted to mention like two or three things that I thought was quite intriguing with the new fund establishment. So our brand newbies, our new SMSF establishments in the December quarter. So we had just under 9,000 new SMSFs establishing the quarter, which is actually pretty high for a quarterly amount. And of the new SMSFs, here are the interesting things. 37.8% of them came from New South Wales. Go the Blues.
Wow.
The season has started, so obviously we've got to start thinking about state of origin. So just, quite a high percentage from New South Wales. And more interestingly, I think, is the demographics of those who have commenced these SMSFs. So 39% of them, Darin, are from the age group of 35 to 44. So we're seeing younger kind of demographics coming in and setting up SMSF. So they're seeing the validity and, that whole choice and control mechanism of the SMSF space. So that's interesting. And the other thing that's interesting is the actual, so the ATO kind of marry up for new SMSF establishments, they marry up a few things about the people who have started them. And using the ABS, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, they actually have been able to determine that about 72.6% of those who have commenced an SMSF have taxable incomes between naught and $150,000. So I think that this whole old adage of, SMSFs being for the wealthy and for, only a certain part of the population is totally changing. And we're seeing more kind of, people coming in who are seeing, the long-term benefits of a self-managed super fund. And that's really exciting from where I see it. So a couple of, interesting stats.
Yeah, there's so much I could say about that. Probably the one thing I will say is I hope the people in Canberra actually do read these statistics
Yeah.
because it should dispel some of the myths that they like to prolong, especially with their policy making. But we won't go into Division 296 tax today because I could be here for the next 2 hours talking about that, especially in the lead up to the election.
Hopefully we never have to talk about it again, Darin. But anyway, I don't think that.
Yeah, we can only keep our fingers crossed. But
Exactly.
Tracy, in our discussions about
Yeah.
tax planning for
Mm,
SMSFs, you
mm.
came up with three categories that people should probably consider when they're looking at tax strategies for their self-managed super fund, didn't you? What
Yeah.
are those three buckets?
Yeah, thanks, Darin. So I'm a big framework person. So if I can put something into a flow chart or a diagram or whatever it is, then be sure I'm going to do it. And so a few years ago, I came up with this whole three kind of step process, if you like, around year-end planning, and predominantly we're talking tax planning for your SMSF. And so the first one we need to start with is probably, I shouldn't say this, but it's probably not the most exciting one, but it's still like very necessary. And that's what I called the must do's. So this is your compliance issues. This is making sure that the SMSF is going to be squeaky clean and, that we're going to be able to avail ourselves of all of the fun stuff moving forward by making sure that we've got the baseline or the foundation right. So that's the must do's. Then the second part that we'll move on to is the should do's. So these are the strategies. So there's about 8 different strategy pieces that, it's good to refresh yourself on at the end of each year or planning for the end of each year. And then finally, we get on to what we've called the can do's. So must do, should do, can do. And these are kind of, prompts for, future planning, kind of future decision making, and just some really interesting aspects of where your SMSF might sit within the overall industry, and perhaps there's some things that you haven't yet thought about that you could do or can do in the SMSF. Now, remember our thing, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. So that kind of ties back into that as well. But I think the
Yeah.
must-dos we need to actually focus on first.
Yep. So, as you can probably gather, those three buckets do contain a lot of
Yeah.
material and information. So, today we're going to start at the beginning with the must do's. But the must do list is actually quite big. So, we've decided to split it up into two parts. So, today's podcast will be the first part of the must do's, and the next podcast episode will be about the second part of the
Yeah.
must-dos. And probably the thing we're concentrating on today will be around contribution strategy and what you should do in relation to that. So let's kick it off. We're gonna try and get through at least nine of these items, and
Yeah.
the first one has to do with a bit of housekeeping, really, doesn't it, Trace?
Yeah, and a lot of these must-dos are actually housekeeping in one way, shape, or another, Darin, because you've got to when I speak to my SMSF clients, and I've already started tax planning meetings with my clients this week. So, we're very much on top of where we need to be for reasons, that we've only got a certain amount of time up our sleeves. And also I've probably trained my clients really well, Darin, to make sure that they're not calling me on the 29th of June. And certainly not on the 30th of June, because I'm probably out for a long lunch on that day. But the first part of this is all about housekeeping of prior year breaches. So you would hopefully think, and sorry, let me just start with something else. Let me start with something else, because I wrote it down and I think it's cool. I want everyone to just realize that the planning for for the year end, I should say, planning for year end is not just something that magically happens by the SMSF year end fairy, and it just, you just kind of click your fingers and it's done. Someone is actually doing something. And generally speaking, this will be your administrator, your advisor, your accountant. They'll be heavily involved in these year end decision making processes, and hopefully reminding you and prompting you of, what needs to be done. But remember, your responsibility as a trustee of an SMSF is to know what's going on. So you still have a responsibility, even if someone else is helping you do all of this stuff. So that's kind of where I wanted to start. Forgot that part. But let's talk about now prior year breaches. So when you have your SMSF accounts done and the tax return prepared, before lodging that tax return, you'll remember that you actually have to get the SMSF audited. So it goes to an auditor, and the auditor has a look at everything. And if there are some breaches, then those breaches, and what we're talking here, breaches, is something that you haven't done correctly. So you've actually done something that's against the SMSF SIS legislation, the superannuation legislation, then there's going to be a breach noted. There's going to be some sort of notation or letter that comes to you to say, well, you've got a breach here. It's up to the trustees of the super fund, Darin, to then make sure that those breaches are rectified prior to the next year end. So that's kind of where we start with our year end plan is there something we have to fix up? Perhaps we've got an in-house asset issue. Perhaps we've done something else where we've got to actually fix it up, and we've got to actually take action on that. As we talked about in the last podcast, if we don't take action, then we're going to be in all sorts of strife. So prior year breaches, not very exciting, but an absolute must do.
No, it's very relevant to what we spoke about last time, isn't it? That whole management of the in-house asset issue, if you've got one, to actually put a plan in place, but you've actually got to also give some evidence that you stuck to that plan and implemented it in order to try and get your in-house assets down to below 5% of the total value of the fund's assets.
Yeah, exactly, Darin. And so that's kind of where we start. Now, what do we have to fix up from the year before? And then the next part is, because we are focusing on all of the, must-dos around getting money into super today. The next part is, okay, well, have we actually made contributions to the fund this year in the 2025 year? And if that's the case, what are the must-dos that we need to think about? So we start with concessional contributions. And to remind all of our lovely podcast listeners, the concessional contributions, of course, are those contributions that we're going to claim a tax deduction for. Whether that is an employer claiming the deduction or us personally claiming the deduction, if somebody along the chain is claiming a tax deduction, then that's going to be a concessional contribution. So have we made any in this year? And remembering, of course, this year in the 2025 financial year, our concessional contribution cap is 30 grand. Have we got any contributions that kind of go towards that particular cap? But we've got to think about a couple of, anomalies, if you like, Darin, because there are some things that could count towards that cap that we might not actually realise that they do count towards that cap. And the two things that I'm thinking of that have certainly caught my clients out before, it's a bit of a war story, is paying expenses on behalf of the super fund where they haven't been reimbursed.
Yeah.
And if they do that, so if you pay an expense on behalf of your super fund and you don't get reimbursed for that expense by the super fund, then that's going to be a concessional contribution. So if you've gone ahead and made 30 grand of, concessional contributions already, and, you've got this expense that hasn't been reimbursed for whatever reason, then we may have then, an excess contribution problem. And the other thing that kind of has caught out my clients before is the whole concept and notion, Darin, of where you've got an insurance policy that's set up as a superannuation, structured as a superannuation account. And so you pay the premiums. This is outside of the SMSF. So you pay the premiums on this insurance policy for life insurance, and it's structured as a superannuation contribution. Now, because you might claim a tax deduction for that super contribution, i.e., the insurance premium, that's actually counted towards your concessional contribution cap, even though it's outside of the SMSF. So we've got to look at every kind of avenue of what superannuation accounts or what's deemed to be a superannuation account for the member, and make sure we've ticked all of those boxes and included everything so that we don't have a problem with our concessional cap.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you made, because there's actually a draft tax ruling, I think, at the moment in train where insurance proceeds has actually been referenced. That's inside a super fund as being treated as a contribution, which has actually taken some people by surprise. So that whole insurance proceeds thing is probably a bit of a grey area when it comes to how it gets treated, and probably particularly tricky if you're talking about a situation where the cover is actually taken outside of the super fund, which you may not necessarily make that nexus completely. So I understand
Yeah.
how people could easily get thrown by that and realize that, oh, you know, I need to sort this out because yeah, it's something that I didn't really take a note of.
Yeah, absolutely, Darren. And for one of my clients, a few years ago now, they didn't tell me that they had this other insurance policy slash superannuation policy, and it was only after we had done all of this tax planning for them. It was only we found out purely, it was almost by mistake. We found out because they didn't tell us, and we didn't ask the right questions back then. So we now ask the questions. We make sure that we understand all of the superannuation accounts. What is a superannuation account for our clients? Because sometimes as an SMSF person, we can have blinkers on and we can only be looking at the SMSF itself and not thinking outside of that. So that's really important because if we've gone over the $30,000 of concessional contribution cap, then we might be able to avail ourselves of, of the catch-up concessional rules. We might be able to, restructure it so it's not a concessional. It might be able to be a non-concessional if we haven't claimed a personal contribution for it yet, deduction for it yet. But otherwise, it's going to be an excess. And, I'm not a super fan of having to pay excess, contributions tax.
No.
If but why? I'm actually not a fan of paying too much tax per se. So why are we going to pay more than we need to? So important to understand what contributions you've made, what are they classified as, and how close to the cap you are from a compliance perspective. That's really important.
Yeah, 100%. And as you say, all of these issues have flow-on effects too, don't they? Because if you do exceed your concessional contributions caps, it can be automatically treated as a non-concessional contribution. But what if you've exceeded that cap already as well? And then you go into a whole myriad of other issues of hurt that you probably don't really want to experience. But you
Yeah.
also did raise a good point that this is probably a good time to have a look at whether or not you do have any carry forward unused concessional contributions caps
Yeah.
or cap
Yes.
space that you
Yeah.
haven't done in prior years because, well, there's a bit of an opportunity to get ahead of the curve again, and maybe put a little bit more money into super because you can.
Yeah, absolutely, Darin. And certainly we'll just remind everyone of what that looks like when we get to our should do's, because that is one of the strategies, is to think about, well, can you actually avail yourselves of higher caps? And I had a tax planning meeting with one of my clients just yesterday, and one of the things we talked about was, from a tax perspective, the tax savings on making further contributions looks like this. And so we did talk about that catch-up concessional contributions. But if you made a great segue into the next bit, Darin, in the sense of if you've made a concessional contribution and you've exceeded that cap, it might be treated as a non-concessional. So the next thing, of course, we have to look at is, well, what non-concessional contributions have we actually made? And just to remind everybody about the non-concessional, these are contributions where you have not claimed a tax deduction. So it's coming from after-tax dollars. Wherever those after-tax dollars have come from, it's going to be a non-concessional contribution. And of course, this year, 2025, we have a $120,000 non-concessional contribution cap, being 4 times the concessional. And so we can make up to $120,000. But then, of course, have we made that? And if we have gone over that, or if we're close to going over that and we're planning to put more money in, then then we've got to look at all of the flow-on effects from there. So one of those flow-on effects is, well, actually, is our total super balance less than $1.9 million? Because if our total super balance at 30 June 2024 is actually more than $1.9 million, we can't actually make a non-concessional contribution anyway. So if you haven't done your SMSF work for last financial year as yet, then you're actually not going to know exactly what your total super balance figure was. So it's really important to understand that first before we can know whether we can actually have the super fund accept this non-concessional contribution, or what does it look like. So I know that most of the SMSF members have probably logged onto the ATO portal at some point and checked out what their total super balance figure is, Darin. But if it hasn't been finalised, then that figure that's on the ATO portal is not going to be accurate. So just be mindful of that. You've got to actually understand what the accurate figure is of the total super balance before we go ahead with non-concessionals.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of alluded to it at the start after I read the sponsor's message that just keeping records up to date is so important. I mean, I know that SMSFs aren't like larger super funds where you've got an administrative team to actually do day-to-day reporting or actually day-to-day maintenance of the administration area. But having said that, really for strategy and particularly year-end strategies, it is so important to know exactly where you're at, just to know
Mhm.
exactly what you can do. And a lot of it can actually be risk mitigation. I mean, if you
100%.
don't, just like you said, if you don't know how much of the non-concessional contributions cap you've used and whether or not you've already triggered a bring forward set of non-concessional contributions, then how do you know whether or not, even if you inadvertently make an excess contribution, either concessional or non-concessional, as we've just discussed, it can have implications for one overage can have implications for both.
Yeah,
Then how do you know how you're going to mitigate your risk and manage the situation? You kind of
100%.
can't unless you know where you stand right there and then.
Yeah, and this is why this whole year-end planning is so important, Darren. I love that kind of, this is all about risk mitigation, and 100% it's about risk mitigation, because if we do our must-dos, then we should be fine to get and go into our should-dos, because we have actually, we have lowered that kind of, that risk element of not having it right, or the flow-on effect. Because, we've said this, I don't know how many times in the last 15 episodes of our podcast, Darren. The SMSF world is quite complex, and you peel. It's like the onion, isn't it? There's so many layers that we keep peeling away here, and there's so many kind of cause and effect stuff that's going on. So there's so many. It's kind of this ripple effect that's happening all the time. A contribution here is going to have an element, five steps down the way. So non-concessional. We've talked about non-concessional quite a bit, or we've talked about the terminology around getting more liquidity into the SMSF if we need liquidity. And so one of the ways of getting more liquidity into the fund is to make more contributions. But how do we know if we can make more contributions if we haven't actually done this risk assessment, if we haven't actually compared what we can do and what we have done? So
Yeah.
really important to start with this, hence it's the first few on the list. And then, of course, we go on to bring forward rule. You've already alluded to that. So bring forward rule, we can only do a 3-year bring forward if our total super balance is below $1.68 million. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure that our total super balance is up to date. And that means we've got to have 2024 done. And I guess this is why, some of the tax planning in the SMSF world, Darin, happens so late in the piece, because some of our SMSF work is not done. The compliance work is not finalised and done until 15th of May, which is the tax deadline. So we kind of only have about 6 weeks to get the tax planning done. So yeah, it's all very complicated, isn't it?
It is. I mean, nothing's really simple. And I probably jumped the gun a little bit there because it really puts into perspective the 3 buckets that you've identified. Because if you don't do your must-dos, you can't really do your should-dos or your
Yeah.
can-dos, because you don't actually have that ability to do it, because you're still catching up with making sure your house is in order before you
Yeah.
can actually strategize about absolutely optimizing how you can use your super fund to build your wealth. So really important foundation to use here.
Yeah.
Now, with the concessional contribution, or really, it's really goes under the category of personal deductible contributions. Um, you have to obviously satisfy some commitments, but also if you're in a particular age bracket too, so you have to satisfy some commitments as well. I'm probably getting two things a little bit mixed up here. Firstly, with the personal deductible contributions, you have to put in your notice of intent to claim a tax deduction first. And this doesn't
Yep.
have to be done before the contribution's made, which makes it a little bit tricky, but it's got to be done before the end of the year or financial year.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Darin. So if we want to claim, so anybody can make a personal deductible contribution at face value. We will talk about a particular age group in just a second, but you can make a personal deductible contribution. And if you make that contribution and you want to claim a tax deduction for that, there's, a notice of intent to claim form that has to be done, must be lodged with your trustee. So remember those two hats, member hat, trustee hat. You must lodge it with your trustee. It's good practice for the trustee to acknowledge it, so you've got that acknowledgement. That generally happens under a resolution or a minute that's signed. And you actually have to make sure that this document is done and in place, yes, by the end of year, but also to make sure that it's done before you lodge your individual tax return. So if you lodge your individual tax return and you don't have a note, so it's when the due date. So it's the lodgement date or the due date, whichever is earlier. But if you haven't done this and you lodge your individual tax return and then you want to claim the tax deduction for the superannuation contributions, it's a big no deal. Like you can't claim the deduction. And likewise, if you've lodged your tax return and you haven't noted on your tax return about the superannuation contribution, and you go to amend your tax return, then that's going to raise a whole lot of issues with the ATO because you haven't literally followed the process that they've set out as the regulator. So if you are going to claim a personal contribution, please make sure that you've got the notice of intent to claim form sorted. And again, your accountant or administrator should be able to provide that for you. But otherwise, the ATO website is really easy to find if you type in notice of intent to claim. So that's pretty easy. So, but yeah, I have had clients in the past that have, particularly new clients that have come to us where they've said, I've made this, contribution to super and I want to claim a deduction. I'm like, well, where's the notice of intent to claim form? It doesn't exist. So therefore we've got no chance of being able to claim it.
Yeah, and the ATO is definitely getting better at cross-matching data as well. So it's not like, oh, it's something slightly small and inadvertent. It won't get picked up. The ATO
Yes.
is definitely on the improve of cross-matching their data
Yes.
from several different sources, which obviously all melds into one for the individual. So don't think that they're a little bit slack on that front because they're actually getting quite good at it and very
Yeah,
sophisticated at it. So make sure
definitely.
it's just you have to make sure that you do it properly.
Definitely, Darin. And I think the other thing to mention about the notice of intent to claim is if you have if your tax agent that lodges your individual personal tax returns is different to your SMSF tax agent or accountant or administration firm that lodges the SMSF return, make sure that they both know about this whole intent to claim. Make sure that your left hand and right hand kind of knows what they're doing because otherwise it can fall through the gaps. And I would hate for you to miss out on the tax deduction of the superannuation contributions because the reason we often do a before tax contribution is for the tax deduction. So
Yeah.
You don't want to mess that up. That would be a
Yeah.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah, not right hand not talking to the left hand is no excuse for any sort of mistake that's made. That's up to you guys to figure out, yep, who's doing what and
Exactly.
who should know about what is being
E-
done.
Exactly. And when
And
you're the member of the SMSF and the trustee of the SMSF, Darin, that right hand and left hand is absolutely important that it gets on, we
yeah,
understand what's going on because it's the
yeah,
same person.
yeah, 100%. Now, the other thing I was alluding to was actually the work test.
A wet test. Yeah.
For people between a certain age range that they
Yes.
have to satisfy before they can actually make a personal deductible contribution. And it's
Yeah.
probably particularly relevant in the lead up to the election as well, isn't it, Tracey?
Exactly, Darren. And this is what we wanted to finish on, I guess, is because, if you are between the ages of 67 and 74, then you are required to meet the work test in order to be able to claim a tax deduction for a concessional contribution. So the work test, is to remind everybody, is 40 hours of work in a consecutive 30 days. So most people between the ages of 67 and 74, if they're not working, they can't always just jump into work, and it has to be genuine work. It can't be just, Darin, I'll pay you, $500 and, therefore you've got your work test. That's a really cheap rate, by the way, for 40 hours of work. I didn't think about the numbers of that one very well, did
I
I?
think I'd be charging slightly higher than that, but anyway.
Yeah, I would hope so. I would hope so. But of course, one thing that is a potential for those in that age bracket, if they're so inclined, is the Australian Electoral Commission are looking for a whole lot of people to work for the election. So if you are thinking about the fact that you want to make this contribution, you want to claim that deduction in this financial year, then we do every kind of year, every time the election comes around, we promote this as an option for those people to genuinely meet that work test if they wanted to. So I know that I think it was Liam Short, actually put a link on his LinkedIn profile to the Australian Electoral Commission website where they were wanting people to apply for jobs. So there you go.
That's a good idea. That's a good initiative. And I know it might sound a little bit flippant about, oh, really? The Electoral Commission, would I work a polling booth station on the 2nd of May, as it turns out to be this year? But it's actually something that gets discussed a lot when we talk about satisfying the work test of whether or not you can do it. And again, you'll get a paper trail. It's an official, hiring of your services. You'll probably get some sort of a pay slip as well. So all of the documentational standards will be met by that, and it's 100% legitimate, and it's much better, as you said. I'm more expensive than $500 for the 30 or 40 hours, but it takes out of the equation having to not make things up, but try and figure out ways of how do I legitimately get it. And babysitting the kids for 10 hours or whatever, that's not going to cut the mustard. And that's probably an area where a lot of trustees actually do go in creative techniques to say that, oh, no, I satisfied the work test, but it actually has to be a little bit more official than that. And the
Yeah.
Electoral Commission and working a polling booth on the 2nd of May, that is actually a pretty good option.
Yes. And remember, of course, it has to be 40 hours. So it's
Yeah.
a little more than just the one day of the polling booth, but it is a very legitimate way of doing something. And, in the good old days, if you want to call them that, Darin, there were some fairly interesting ways that people were trying to get around the work test, and unfortunately, I had to tell quite a few clients over those years that is not a legitimate way of meeting the work test. Babysitting your grandkids is not a legitimate way of doing that, and the whole introduction. If we just divert slightly for 30 seconds away from SMSF world, we do need to be mindful that we've got single touch payroll these days. We have all of these other requirements that if you are actually going to want to put together some sort of, scheme to try and, meet this work test, that you're probably going to fall foul of, all of these other things that the ATO have requirements on, particularly single touch payroll and that reporting to the ATO at that point in time. So please make sure it's legitimate. I'm certainly not advocating for you to go and just pretend that you've met the 40 hours in the 30 days. But remember that if you are in that age bracket, you absolutely have to meet the work test if you want to claim a personal deductible contribution. So maybe the AEC is one of the only ways you might be able to do that.
Yeah, it's certainly a solid way, and obviously we don't want anybody to make up
Of course.
situations where they think that they've satisfied the work test when they actually haven't. And again, back to my original point, the ATO and other regulatory bodies as well, not just the ATO, are improving their methods of detection and the audit trails that they are wanting to see.
Yeah.
before they will grant that action. So it's not just a bit of a nudge and a wink and off you go. It is actually being policed quite seriously. So please don't think that you can just make up, I drove the grandkids to school or whatever the hell it is, like a family Uber driver. It does have to be a legitimate form of form of employment with legitimate receipts to back you up. That's
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of my more cheeky clients, Darin, years ago said to me that he's a great coffee maker and could I employ him for that period of time so he could make coffee for me and my team. And I was like, well, that's not going to get across the line either, buddy. But, nice try. Nice try.
Yeah, yeah. No harm in thinking about these things,
Exactly.
but please do realize that it has to be legitimate before you can actually put it in action and make it part of, I satisfied the work test, because
Exactly.
otherwise you're going to come a cropper. And again, as we always say, you don't want to fall foul of any of these compliance issues, because guess what? That will just add to another world of hurt that you just don't want to be in.
Yeah, exactly, Darin. So I think that covers off our kind of getting money in and the kind of must-dos around that part, and we'll finish off the next range in the next podcast, which is good.
Yep, we've covered off part one. So thanks again, Tracey, for deconstructing a little bit of that for us, but also taking us through some of the important issues. And of course, we'll continue on with the must-dos in the next episode. But thanks again for your time as usual, Tracey.
My pleasure, Darin. I'm really enjoying the podcast series, so it's really good.
Look, thanks to my production team, obviously, who puts these things together and posts it on all our relevant publication platforms. So thank you very much for their time and effort. But most of all, thank you very much to you, the subscribers and listeners and viewers, for joining us today. Again, as usual, we hope you've got something important out of it, and we hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as we've enjoyed bringing the session to you. Other than that, we look forward to having you join us for the next episode of the Trusted Trustee podcast. Until then, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye for now.